Hi, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Analytics. We are a team of enthusiasts on all things data science, analytics, and generative AI. This is going to be a really exciting episode. It's a follow on to what we looked at in part one of retail prediction models. Just taking you a little bit back down the memory lane, in the part one of this episode, we kind of explored this idea of hybrid models, right? We essentially said, how do we combine the outputs from a core statistical data model along with the power of an LLM to start to make more sense of the model results, especially from the point of a business user or a business analyst who's trying to leverage some of these statistical capabilities. So, my name is Roshan. I'm joined by my co-host and co-founder Abhijit, and we're going to dive into a few exciting examples of how to take advantage of foundation models, LLMs, in the retail prediction space. Abhijit, I want to kick you off with maybe one question playing on my mind, really. If I'm a retailer and I have, let's say, some historical data about my sales, about my promotions from the past, how do I even begin to use that data to train my model, right? Before I can get some kind of meaningful results. How do I even go about doing that?
Uh, Thanks, Roshan. Right, and that's a great question that you ask, and it's a great follow-up to what we talked about in the last episode. Is how do we create a narrative on the data that we have, and how do we combine it with the statistical models that the traditional statistical models that have been there around for decades for now. So what we will do in this episode is we'll try to run a quick demo, and this is a live demo that we'll be doing on historical data set as you mentioned, and that's always risky. So let's hope that this works. We'll try to see how it makes sense from a retail perspective. We'll be running some models on a historical data set, and we have around 2 years worth of data set for an apparel brand. And let's start with what we call it like an everyday fit crew neck t-shirt. Let me first walk you through the basic data set that we'll be running the model against. So what you see over here is a typical data set that you will see from a sales perspective. We have a set of weekly data against the discount. So what we'll do now is we'll try to run this particular data set against a couple of statistical models, and then we see how to make sense of it.
So, Abhijit, while you're pulling that up, I see there are a couple of options here. Particularly the role of the user is a very interesting facet because we talked about how making sense of the data has to be very contextual to a certain kind of user, certain kind of business user. And then I also see that you have something around the life cycle stage of that product. So am I right in understanding that these are going to be hyperparameters used to train your model as part of the model fitment process?
That's absolutely right, and it's interesting, right? When we talked about storytelling in the first part of the series, one of the aspect that we spoke about was context. In what context is the dashboard being consumed? Again, right? Dashboard is a very vague term that I'm using here, but in what context is the set of numbers or that data being consumed? Who's consuming it? When it is being consumed, right? And at what stage it is getting consumed? And that's exactly what we have tried to do over here. Think of in this particular use case, as we talked about, right? We'll be showing that the impact of discount to the sales figures and use that particular data as the base to then possibly try and devise a pricing strategy or a discount strategy for that matter. What you see over here is three typical use cases or three typical roles that possibly will try to consume this data. And we'll start with someone like a pricing analyst, because your pricing analyst will possibly have the final say in saying whether you want to have a 10%, 20%, or even a 50% discount for that matter. The next hyperparameter is the stage, right? Which stage the product is in, or which stage the SKU is in, whether it is an introduction stage or growth phase or even maturity phase, right? Because it does take those historical data into consideration as to which stage that particular product was in order to make those final decisions about the numbers.
So while this is training the model on this historical data you've selected, I'm curious, and for the benefit of our audience, what kind of a model are you even training here? What is really, tell us a little more about what's happening behind the scenes here.
Um, in this case, right, we have taken like two very fundamental models over here. And since the use case was the pricing analyst of the retail apparel was trying to devise a discount strategy based on historical pricing data, we based it off two statistical models. First one was regression. As we know, like that's one of the most fundamental models used in the historical data context. And the second one was price elasticity. We chose elasticity because we wanted to see as to what effect the price change has in the demand, or what effect the price change has in the mind of the consumer. And then we kind of derive our narrative around the numbers that are churned based on these two data models.
There you go. And it's interesting to see all this pop up so quickly. I can see it barely took a couple of seconds for the model training to be done and some of these results to pop up right here. I am now even more curious, Vijit, what's going on here? How do we start to make sense of the initial model results? And also, how do I know if the model fitment has been okay with my historical data, right? Can I trust the model fitment here to be able to proceed with anything beyond this point?
That's a very good point, actually, right? And that's the whole reason to kind of give that particular confidence to the consumer of this particular dashboard or of this particular model, right? I won't go through each of the variables as we have already gone through in part one of the episode. So I'll drop in the link below, and anyone who has interest can go into part one and have a look at this. But let me go through a couple of things, right? Starting with the fitment. So, as a consumer of this particular dashboard, right, when someone looks at a trend line, they kind of get a general idea as to, okay, I mean, I'm fairly like, okay, I know what is going on here, right? So what you see over here is the purple or the pink, which denotes the actual sales, and on the green side you have the predicted ones, like the fitment piece that you talked about, and then the orange one shows the discount that was applied when that particular sales, actual sales and predicted sales happened. And finally, what we see over here, which is a pretty interesting piece, which with the use of AI has become fairly common in most of the dashboards, is the anomaly detection, right? What you see over here is in the week of 17 December, sales were unexpectedly higher. That's like, okay, we predicted a certain amount and the actual sales were high. Now that can be attributed to multiple reasons, right? 17 December, the week of 17 December will typically be a high velocity time for most of the retailers in the country, and that can be attributed to the outlier that we see in this particular chart. But in general, right, what you see is highly correlated data. And that essentially means that a general reduction or increase in price is directly impacting the consumer sentiment, or it's directly impacting the sales. And it's because of that, the confidence meter is pretty high. And what that essentially means is the numbers that have been churned out by these models can be pretty confident of the general decision or the recommendations that the model is giving. So if the model is telling you that for a single percentage increase in discount, if I'm getting a three unit increase, then you can be fairly confident that for a single percent discount increase, your sales will increase by around 3 to 4 units.
You make two very interesting points here, Abhijit. As a business user, one of my worry often is I am buried in tons and tons of data coming to me. What's interesting here is that the tool is able to flag those specific anomalies, right? It's able to indicate to me that while there is a reasonably good fitment of the predictive model with the actual data, there are indeed certain anomalies in that fitment too. And that brings my attention to a few specific areas that need to be looked at in further detail, right? Or need to be analyzed in further detail, as opposed to me getting lost in a data spanning over multiple years. And then the other interesting piece to me here is if you were to simply state this technically to somebody like, hey, my model confidence is indicated by R square and its value is like 0.6, whatever, right? As more or less a pragmatic business user, at that point, I think I'm quite likely lost. How do I interpret a value like that? And what does it make sense to me in terms of me being able to use this model further? I see that your confidence meter also has some nuanced summary underneath it, right? It's trying to describe an interpretation as to how did we infer that the confidence level is high. Is that where we using foundation model or an LLM to be able to analyze the result and explain it? Is that what's happening here?
I would say it's a combination of multiple things, right? The first one, as I would say here, is we use, as you said, the model fit, right? What's the regression? What the regression numbers have been churned out. The second one is signal strength, and then the third one is stability, and then the fourth one is data coverage. So we base these four basic data points, and then these are essentially used to kind of generate the narration that you see over here. Now, it's pretty interesting to note over here, right? And I believe we'll also do one more episode on this as to what's the optimal use of LLMs over here, right? And how much do you trust LLMs about churning out correct content, non-hallucinated content? What are the prompts that you provide? And what is the response that you get? So in this case, I would say it's a combination of both. Although we have leveraged LLMs to generate the content that you see on the screen, it's not purely the LLMs that we are trusting it on. We have provided computed statistical data to the LLM to then come up with a inference that you see over here.
Got it. So making sure that you've provided it the right context, which is call it more hard-nosed statistical data, along with very specific guardrails, very specific prompting capabilities to make sure that the LLM's interpretation of this does not veer off the rails. Let's move on to something else. I think we've looked at what some of these raw model results are. Again, coming back to my role, we talked about the pricing analyst. What are the takeaways for me from a business sense out of these results? How do I start to make sense of that? How do I maybe start to even plan some scenarios on the basis of that?
Yeah, that's an interesting pivot actually, right? And before we pivot, I'll just have one final point to talk about from a previous discussion, which was about the confidence on LLMs or how to make optimal use of LLMs. And that's where I believe most of the data teams kind of fall behind at this point of time. Most of them are overly trusting the LLMs to generate the right sort of an output, or some of them are not even, or like under, it's like underused. And the right amount of business plus, I would say, the engineering capabilities here, if you mix both of them together, then you kind of get a pretty good quality output from an LLM. So moving on to your next question, let's think from a actionable perspective. Like what's the one actionable thing that I get from this particular model? And let's talk about. I'll talk about the summary or the narration piece first, and then we'll go to the discount, or when then we'll go to the simulation. Starting with the discount impact, as we said here, right, the confidence of this model is pretty high. So the discount impact also is pretty positive. And in this case, the consumer of this model can essentially be highly confident that a discount percentage increase would essentially increase the sales by around 3 to 4 units. So that confidence for anyone who's consuming this model should be very high. The second one, as we talked about earlier, was the relevance to its product life cycle. Given that the SKU that we talked about is in its maturity phase, strategic discounting can be an effective tool to boost sales and manage the inventory, because now in this phase, inventory management becomes much more critical. And the third one is implications for decision making, which is like, okay, there is a strong positive correlation, and that was shown in the regression numbers as well as in the elasticity numbers, suggests that a good discount strategy could drive the sales significantly. And finally, the trust, the P square value does indicate that the model trust level is pretty high, and the confidence level of this model should be pretty high. Now, coming to a second part of it, which was the discount impact. And what we have tried to do over here is kind of try to build out a small simulation tool which says that you have like a 8% increase. What's the impact on my sales? You have a baseline sales of say around 200, and since we based off two models, one was regression and one was elasticity, what we have done here is taken a typically weighted average and come up with a combined estimate of say around 225, which is like, okay, you have a high end of 230, which is based off regression, and then you have a low end of 220, which is based on elasticity model.
I love how simply put this is. I mean, in a few years ago, right, if one were expected to model something like this, I may have to really depend on maybe a team of analysts to look at the raw results, right? Try to make sense of this, and then try to play out some scenarios for me. Right, I would probably make an ask and say, what would happen if I were to discount this product category by 15%? And then somebody would have to go crunch the numbers, right? Make sense of it, look at also the margin analysis around it, and then come back to me with results a few days later. It's just fascinating to me how these two or three models working in conjunction, both the regression model, the elasticity model, as well as your foundation model, working in conjunction, are bringing the results to me in such an intuitive manner that I can actually action upon it right away. So go on, Abhijit, tell us more.
That's true, right? And in this case, we have just taken the basic weighted average, right? Now, that was probably the most easiest thing to do from a demo perspective. But now you kind of combine these to the with the hyper parameters that you added, right? Say for example, life cycle stage. We haven't considered life cycle stage in the discount tool impact as we have considered in the narration at this in this demo. So now if you start adding those kind of hyper parameters to this simulation tool, then what you're essentially getting is, say for example, at this point of time you're 88% confident, you're now getting to a much more 92 to 93% confidence level when it comes to your final estimate of what your sales will be for that given price point.
Given that these barely cost us a couple of seconds to train for fitment, and then maybe perhaps only a few seconds to run an inference. And likewise, I noticed that it's barely, cents to train. I kind of see tremendous utility of a tool like this in the hands of a pricing planner, a promotions planner with most retailers. Coming back to your thought on the results being actionable, I'm curious to dive into that recommendation section we see on the screen. Is that going to help me plan something more concrete, right? Undertake some true actions based on what the model is telling me?
Yes, I would say the recommendation space is essentially based on three fundamental aspects. What can I do with the numbers, right? One is like, what can I do with these numbers? It's very much heavily dependent on Going back to our hyper parameters, which is who's looking at the dashboard, who's consuming it, and second is when are these getting consumed. And that's why you see, right, the first one is the model recommends that okay, you can start by implementing a tier discount strategy. Then you go to test the elasticity, how much of risk that you can take at this point of time is also a factor, right? I mean, it's not in the introduction stage, it's not in its decline stage, it's in a maturity stage. So what is your risk taking capacity here when it comes to testing the price elasticity with controlled promotions? And finally, it is the third point is which more or less most of the regression models depend on is you're leveraging the p-value to refine the pricing thresholds, right? That's the third recommendation that the model gives, and these recommendations typically would change based on your hyperparameters, right? If a category manager is viewing it in its introduction stage or a decline stage, the recommendations will change based on the numbers and based on the data.
I love how specific it has gotten in those recommendations, particularly the one where it's suggested to experiment with those discounts in increments of, say, 2 to 5%. I think it allays a lot of fear that often planners would have that, are my interventions going to be effective? And am I over enthusiastically discounting and hurting my margins in some ways as well for a given category? So, the fact that it considered the maturity phase or the life cycle of the product and then recommended a plan of action here, I think it's interesting to see how that contextual information has been incorporated here through the hyperparameter. You led us to a very nicely fitting example, Abhijit. I'm curious what happens if the data were not so much of a sweet spot. Maybe there is not such a high correlation, a strong correlation between my discount and my sales. Do you have an example you could lead us to?
Yeah, that's right, actually, right. And that's where what a second skew here is right about, which is the everyday fit swimsuit. Use a data set, as you mentioned, which is not as highly correlated as the first one. And let's see what the model tells us.
I can imagine a category like that having maybe a lower price elasticity.
Right, that's right, right. And you see the classification that it has given is it's an elastic. So here you see, right, the confidence meter is, I would say, at a moderate level. I mean, you still have a good correlation, but not a great correlation between the discount and the sales numbers. Given the skew that we have seen here, it's fairly evident that it's a swimsuit, right? I mean, no matter the discount, if anyone wants to buy it, they'll buy it. So you see the narration has completely changed in this case. Now, someone looking at the confidence meter, they essentially have a picture in mind that okay, it's not green, it's orange. So that's the first cue of someone who's consuming it saying that okay, I can't rely on these numbers. I can't rely on the data that I already have or the data that I've given to the model. And that kind of impacts your tool as well. Now, in this case, your baseline sales were around 180, and let me go to a pretty high discount, right? Around 30%. And what you see is, right, the combined estimate is just around 185. So it's like even with a 30% discount, what you're seeing is a pretty moderate or conservative increase in the total sales. And that's essentially evident because the correlation was pretty low. And in this case, the recommendations have changed. Now you see that it's not telling you to implement a tiered discount structure because the model itself is not confident of the numbers that is being provided to it. So the recommendations change, the numbers change, and the narration changes.
Interesting. It's also asked me to be cautious in planning those discounts. I mean, it's in no uncertain terms, it's saying the approach should be closely monitored to evaluate the impact. It's realized that given the confidence level is lower in this case. And it's also in some ways given me a cap of saying that my targeted discounts it's not wise for me to target discounts beyond, say, 20-23% in this particular category.
That's true. And one interesting point that we have not included in this demo, which can actually be included, is how you look at the competition. None of these numbers or none of this model has taken into consideration what the competition numbers are. And now imagine the impact that something like this would create if you bring in a third variable along with the discount. You bring in the third variable, which is the competition factor. And and now if you start factoring that into the confidence, then what you're essentially getting is a very, very good structured discount strategy without much of a thought process.
It's also a takeaway for me as a planner here that perhaps beyond a certain level of discounts in this category, it might not be very wise to keep pushing on promotions and offers. Maybe I should look at other interventions like placement or how the merchandise is being romanced in a category like this, instead of simply thinking that I can drive an uplift, I can drive volume with a pricing play here.
That's right. And that will be purely from a merchandising or even from a category perspective for that matter as well, right?
That's right. I think if I'm a retailer, I'm already thinking, how do I get my hands on something like this? Is this a matter of just, are we talking about days or weeks to be able to set up something like this, right? This growth strategy planner in a real retail environment?
I would say it purely depends on the parameters you want to test it on, right? I mean, in this case, what we have done is we have basically taken discount and sales as our variables, right? But think of a scenario where you now have to factor in seasonality, you have to factor in competition numbers for that matter. Or I've seen models run with say 10, 15, even 20, even 50 variables, right? So the higher that number of variables or your input parameters get in, the complicated it becomes. But to be honest, I would say something which is based off this particular fundamental ideology wouldn't be a much heavy weight lift for any retailer to get their hands on. It will be difficult to base it off days or weeks, but it certainly wouldn't be months or years for that matter.
Awesome. Thank you for this great demo, Abhijit. And clearly, the tool seems to be exciting. I, for sure, am going to continue playing with this as part of planning activities we do for quite a few clients of ours in retail, in CPG, in e-commerce. So, folks, thanks for staying tuned to this episode today. We are Beyond Analytics. Our mission is supported by Nexlytics. Nexlytics specializes in data analytics and AI for some of the most ambitious global retail brands. Stay tuned for more on the Beyond Analytics channel.